Hi everyone who's just joined us. If you're looking for the conversation between Jemma Desai and Zain Dada about dreaming new ways of sharing and learning, you're in the right place. I'm just going to do a quick introduction to both Jemma and Zain, and then I'm going to hand over to them. So Jemma is a born and bred Londoner who has been reconsidering her work biography after spending the last year looking straight into the void of institutional life. She's currently a researcher and writer and sometimes talks about her feelings in public, and used to have a film programming practice that she hopes to reimagine in a better future. Jemma. Zain is a writer, a cultural producer, a researcher, and an award-winning filmmaker. He's also the co-founder of Khidr Collective Zine, a zine platforming the work of British Muslims, and has featured in publications such as Vice, Huck Magazine, Tate Late, Mill World, and the BBC Asia Network. In 2020, Zain co-founded Khidr Comics Lab, a space for Black, Brown and Muslim storytellers to innovate, experiment, create within the comics medium. So that's just a brief intro into both of our guests today. I'll just say a little bit about what you're going to cover. So in this session, Zain and Jemma will re-articulate each other's work through dialogue and exchange. They're refusing the transactional consumption of online reading and performing and focusing on deep engagement with each other's words and intentions. Zain and Jemma will dream through what could be possible when we radically read, listen, and learn differently. What can other people's intellectual journeys help us to reimagine for ourselves and for each other? Which is a fantastic question, and I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to turn my camera and audio off. I shall hand over to you. But before I go, if anyone who's watching, if you've got questions throughout the session, do pop them in the chat, and Jemma and Zain, I believe, are happy to do questions at the end of the session. So Jemma, Zain, over to you both. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nikki. Just want to start with saying a huge shout out to everyone who's put together the Department of Dreams program. It's an incredible program, and from Imi to Nikki to people we don't know who've put in loads of work, I've been like amazed to see the kind of programming and also the platform as well, in terms of how all of these conversations have manifested. But thank you everyone for jumping on and listening to Jemma and I have this conversation. I want to just begin with giving some context to Jemma's research, this work isn't for us, and kind of frame the conversations we'll be having in the next hour, and then towards the end we'll take questions. But just to begin with, Jemma's research came out, well, Jemma released it on Twitter and sort of shared it with people a week today. This work isn't for us. And really, I was lucky enough to read it beforehand, and I felt really honored to sort of engage with it, and then have some time away and then re-engage with it for the purpose of this conversation. But for me, this work isn't for us is examining so much fatigue from reading things which simply state the raw data that we all intuitively know, and that data contains like the symptoms of, you know, how unequal the cultural sector is, or how it hasn't embodied any change, and people are like, what do we do next? And it's sort of like this vague, impassioned plea without any concrete understanding of historical social context. What Jemma's research did for me, firstly, was to map and sort of understand the sort of the last 30 years of diversity policy, which inadequately deal with, you know, often obviously there are piecemeal things that have happened, and there are significant bits of reform that have happened, and Jemma traverses that with real sensitivity and care. So that's one thing that her research did for me. It examined diversity policy and how difference has been flattened, the flattening of difference, which is a phrase Jemma uses in the research itself. But more than that, or you know, in equal context, Jemma's work also looks at things with a methodology of love and care. And I think what I mean by that is I've not really read research where the methodology is about, it's not about extraction, it's about dealing with people that she was engaging with. So that's cultural workers who are Black and Brown, who have worked in the cultural sector and have had particular experiences, brings out those perspectives with such care and love and vulnerability. So what impact that had on me as someone who spent a relatively short time in the cultural sector is that it gave me a language to define my experiences in the cultural sector thus far. A lot of that, we'll get into in the conversation. But just for people who are hopping on, because I know that I can see the little number of people jumping onto this conversation, I wanted to begin with reading the start of Jemma's research, and that will give people a sense of what she's tackling in her paper. And also the key thing to come out of this is how it can be a continued conversation. It doesn't stop after you release the research. It's hopefully something that you can build coalitions of solidarity with, but also care. So I want to begin with, just to repeat for people joining, to read an extract of Jemma's research, which will frame the conversations that we have in this chat. So this is just to give you some context. This is what Jemma frames as something that she'll tackle in her paper, This Work Isn't For Us. So by presenting data-led, positive common sense cases for cultural activity and access, arts agencies and institutions are obscuring and endorsing historical and contemporary inequity and failing to account for how such narratives diverge from the lived experiences of such cultural workers. Developments and refinements in language of diversity policy over decades have resulted in ahistorical, disembodied and depoliticized approaches to inclusion, and have continued to leave little space for the real testimonies of those cultural workers in the cultural sector. Such policy allows for various hypervisible gestures of benevolent investment on the underrepresented to be performed largely for the benefit of the instigators of the activity, whilst the conditions which unfairly marginalize new entrants go unaddressed and are invisibilized as problems when they emerge. Such practice puts the BAME workforce on the ethical front line of such activity, witnesses to the entrenched behaviors of the creative class, who disproportionately think of themselves as agents of progress, but in fact are both actively and passively become agents of stasis. That the language and concerns of these policies endorse and inscribe not full equity, but merely conditional access for cultural workers who do not fit the universal somatic norm. These policies have further entrenched institutional whiteness, whereby real difference is contained and cultural workers must comply with the universal somatic norm in order to progress. Unaddressed such practice, underscored through professional development, public program, and in an absence of strong cultural criticism, problematizes the notion of representation as a progressive way to address inequality, revealing it to provide an opportunity to cosmetically diversify while still upholding institutional whiteness. Such conditional access is discriminatory, replicating the work of racism and has psychological impacts on those being included on the basis of contortions and constrictions of such diversity, language, and policy. Pluralistic activity endorsed by diversity policy flattens difference and creates a hierarchy of diversity where those who most fit, usually those most proximate to the somatic norm, can succeed most easily. The social dynamics that emerge from such isolation, disavowal, and ahistorical policymaking have a depoliticizing effect, meaning cultural workers' ability to collectivize or even imagine better futures, which is something we're hopefully doing in this convo, is fragmented and threatened. Such depoliticization is contributing to a cultural apartheid where, despite presenting a face of plurality and accommodation, our cultural spaces are effectively sites of mediation, institutional indifference, gentrification, rendering much activity meaningless to all but a select monocultural audience, effectively enacting a social cleansing of cultural spaces. So for those who are also just joining, that is an extract of Jemma's research. And for me, it frames a lot of the things that Jemma deals with. And I think when we get into the conversation a little bit more, I can read some bits of testimony, some bits of testimony for Jemma herself from her own experiences, and also from people she's interviewed. But just to begin with, I guess, Jemma, for you, what was, from your own words and from your own sort of sensibilities, what was the intention behind the research, and how do you feel now that you've sort of, we talked earlier about catharsis, but also compulsion, like a sense that you need to sort of articulate this, but that there's an interesting aspect of your research, which is that it sits outside a framework of needing to conform in any shape. Like, it doesn't need to it's not, there's no call for reform in the research. It's, for me, it's as we discussed, defunding, and it kind of ties in the conversations that are happening, that have been prompted by a really serious the sort of political consciousness we're seeing now, which is really encouraging through the Black Lives Matter movement around abolition and defunding. But yeah, what, from your own words, what was the sort of compulsion to write this work, or is that the right word for it even?
I think like compulsion is such a powerful word, and it's something that I've been sitting with because it's so much work, so many words. Like, this research is really long. And this research isn't just the words that were in that paper. Like, I wrote so much more, and I wrote to so many people during the process of it. And I said so many words, right? And right now it's really interesting because, like, I'm in this zone where I feel like words have no meaning because there's so many words coming at us from institutions talking about these issues, right? And when I wrote it, it really came from like a thing in my body of like, I need to make sense of something that doesn't feel right, yeah? And I got the money through a grant as a result of my CLAW fellowship, which, I mean, was transformative in the sense that I stopped working for a year, but it was really, I had lots of issues with the way that we were taught to be in the sector, and it drew attention to the things that are not tolerated in the sector, right? And also during that time, actually, it also marks a journey that I had with my daughter, who's 3 years old, and sort of seeing how she was seen by the world. She's much more light-skinned than me, and just seeing how her whiteness was reacted to by different people. It was also a time when I was really facing how gentrified my life had become, in terms of the types of people that I was seeing every day and the spaces that I was kind of involved in, and the conversations that I was having too. And also we were seeing the limits of like representation, right? So the reason why we know each other partly is because we both know Madni Yunus. And he had, like, at some point just before I started my research, he was my mentor on CLAW. He left his job at South Bank Centre, and most people on this call will know why he left. He left after a very short time in post, and largely due to the fact he wasn't able to make the changes that he said he wanted to make when he interviewed, right? And that his whole career had demonstrated that he wanted to do. So really coming up against, like, having been allowed access to this program that supposedly made me a cultural leader, but also being really shown quite clearly how conditional that access was and how I'd have to change myself a lot. And so the intention of the research was probably, to begin with, that decision makers would listen and that something would change. So you saying it doesn't call for reform is really interesting, because actually when I wrote it, I think that's what I was asking for. But in the context of releasing it, like after a global pandemic, after like this incredible uprising, like the street speaking, and this incredible education that the world is getting about abolition as opposed to reform, and this idea of what defunding really means as well in relation to those two ideas, I think it's something completely different. It's like this piece, I don't think I care now if decision makers read it, which is a really different thing to when I finished it, actually. I felt really, and when you talked about like not conforming, I couldn't conform, right? Like it wasn't like this intentional, like I'm trying to be so radical by like choosing a different form. It's just, I have read so many reports and I've read and listened to so many people talk about this issue, and it's never made sense to me. It's literally never made sense to me because it's always been disembodied, dehumanizing, also like not cognizant of like my reality, which actually isn't that unusual, but in the context of where I've been working for the past like 15 years is really unusual and really not accounted for. So the kind of childhood that I have, and we might talk about this later, but the sort of social class that I was and the social class that I moved into, all of those things, those narratives are unaccounted for in our cultural institutions. I didn't meet hardly anyone like me. So yeah, I think the intention of the piece is changing all the time. But this idea of like abolition has really, like, it wasn't my intention for this paper to be that, but its meaning has been articulated by this incredible conversation that's happening right now. Yeah. And sorry, I just wanted to say as well, actually, like the research ended, like it was concluded, but you know, the idea is that in a research, like kind of like how your research is, right? You would have an executive summary and then recommendations. And I couldn't write any recommendations like at the end when I'd written it, because I realized that I had kind of gentrified my life in such a way that I could only describe the problem and I couldn't get to the solutions. And also it felt wrong to give the people that I thought would be reading it solutions, because actually they needed to sit with this mess for a bit and the grief of that. And I guess the reason why this dialogue between us two is happening and why I value it so much is that during the process of doing this research and having conversations with people, there are people that are doing this work without having to address this problem, if that makes sense. So they are drawing attention to and witnessing radical work that is happening outside of public institutions, that is honoring the plurality and the different, I don't know, honoring the kind of populations of all the cities in the UK in a way that our public institutions seem unable to do. But it felt wrong to put the work of people that are doing this every day into a paper that was kind of drawing such attention to whiteness and the way that whiteness was functioning. I didn't feel I had the right to do that because I had felt I had been kind of contaminated by participating in these institutions. So it's kind of like, I think when we're talking about dreaming, I don't think I'd stepped into that position of dreaming when I'd finished. And I guess this is like this really beautiful opportunity to step into that world with you, with this conversation.
But I think like there's so much there that there's a lot there in what you said, but especially when it comes to, firstly, how self-reflective you are in that process, and that we reflection, the research, and what was sort of like what awakened a sense in me was the seriousness of it. And what I mean by that is the absurdity that you've described, where cultural institutions are unquestionably seen as these spaces that it's essential for them to have public subsidy. We talked about before, what work do they do which is essential really when it comes to points of crisis, especially the point of crisis that we've had recently. And I think that's I think a lot of people on this call, especially Black and brown people who've worked in the arts or any other sectors, but especially in the arts, where you have this perception of the arts being like liberal, lefty, progressive, and you mentioned this in your research. And I even had this sort of naivety going in, thinking, I require the validation of these cultural institutions by either working with them or working within them in order for me to be validated and for my work to feel validated. And then, I went through a process where I realized everyone's making up as they go along. So for me, in terms of the research itself, it really gave me a language to understand how absurd the situation is. Like cultural institutions wielding unquestionable power, and it links to what next, partly, and what we can dream and say. And I think that's what your research really speaks to, which is enough is enough, or, you know, I am not going to Renia Dolodge, who you shared a link of her interview with me this morning, and it was that she's not participating in the game of racism, in terms of this treating racism or inequality as a debate, and that's what really, I guess, is the bridge between, like you said, between our very different bits of research that we've done, is what Madani Yunus calls, and what you quote in the research, which is a cultural apartheid which is happening. And I think, even though I felt it intuitively and in conversations with friends, we wouldn't use those exact terms. We'd just be like, that's a joke, like, or we just use it in our actions. We wouldn't engage with those spaces, and it'd be an unconscious thing of like, we intuitively feel and know this. But I think it was really, that's what made me feel sort of really, you know, it touched me in that way, in terms of giving me a language and also a sense of history. I wasn't familiar with the diversity initiatives, and it doesn't surprise me, but I wasn't familiar with the policies that you outline, which attempt to grapple with this. Like, how come these institutions don't talk about inequality? You know, talk about who is living in the most crowded housing in this country, who has the worst health outcomes, and how racialized that is, the nitty-gritty of that. Like, why isn't that feeding into to how people, and also how unrepresentative these spaces are? But yeah, I think a lot of what your research does is touch on that, and is, well, not even touch on it, goes into it in depth. But we spoke about briefly, like, how the kind of contrast between the hollow statements that these spaces make, and I guess the bridge into the community arts context and institutions and spaces, and the kind of difference there. And there's a quote I would like to read, which is, "It will show how such depoliticization is contributing to, where despite presenting a face of plurality, struggling with that word, and accommodation, our cultural spaces are effectively sites of mediation and gentrification, rendering much activity meaningless to all but select monocultural audiences, effectively enacting a social cleansing of cultural spaces." Yeah, and for me, that's partly also a bridge to the conversation we're having now, which is, what are the spaces that and it maybe is a question for us both now, and a question for you, are there cultural, is this the question I want to ask? I'm just kind of thinking this out loud. But what are the spaces that you feel do you feel it's possible for cultural institutions to engage in any semblance of radical work? A, and B, have you occupied a space where you feel like, you know, have you, through your work and through 15 years of being in the sector, what has been the most nourishing moment for you? Those are two very separate questions. But yeah, with the first one.
But also, like, just some of the stuff that you've said is really incredible as well. And I think, like, so just to go back to like what you were saying about like articulating, and I think like just the act of articulating is the reason why we can't articulate this feeling is because of the thing that you said about history. Like, we don't have access to the history, right? So we're always told that our arrival is the first, and that we're breaking new ground, and like Black and brown people are always emerging, right? So we're always new, and there's only ever like 4% of us in the arts or in the film or whatever, you know, that number is just static. So this idea of reflecting on what might have happened to lead us to that static nature is never explored, and it's not recorded, and it's not held, and we don't have access to the people that have left because there's such shame in those experiences. So really trying to access that and leaving a line for that. And there's a politics involved in that as well, is like, if I articulate it, then you don't have to, right? Then you start from that point and you can move in from that point. So it was like this sense of like paying it forward that was really important. And then the other thing in reference to the Renia Dolodge article that you mentioned is, in it she mentions, and the thing that really stayed with me is that she's talking about all of these statements that are coming, especially from women of color who are working in institutions, about how they've been treated. Like, she specifically talks about Condé Nast, right? And in my piece, I like talk a lot about my experiences, and they're like pretty like humiliating experiences, right? If you think about like who you're supposed to be if you're a cultural leader, those probably aren't things that you're gonna talk about if you want to look powerful, right? So they're like moments of deep vulnerability, but she talks about that as like this middle class version of writing. And she talks about that as in like, why would you be so ungrateful to the thing that will give you power, essentially? You know, like, why would you mess up your own neighborhood, sort of thing? But actually, why do people riot, and why do people loot, and why do they do that? It's like a form of like stopping this really terrible situation that actually isn't the greatest neighborhood, or this mutual like sense of being cared for. So I think there's something there which is really, to me, I worked really instinctively, but it feels like it's starting to make sense as a process and as a political kind of piece of work now, which is like really nice. And then this idea about like community spaces and the absolute irrelevance of spaces now has really been clarified to me, actually. So I think the irrelevance of the spaces started to show up in my body, in the sense that even though I've worked in these places for so long, I still feel so uncomfortable in them. And what does that mean, right? Is that really something that's wrong with me? Or is that something to do with my parents? Like, did my parents not teach me how to behave in this space, right? You know, that kind of thing. Or is there something actually about this space that is actually unwelcoming? And I think we saw that so much, like all of those big spaces in South London, South Bank Centre, the BFI, they're all empty during this global pandemic, which has disproportionately impacted Black and brown people, many of which live in Lambeth, right? So why were those huge spaces just empty, probably being guarded by Black and brown people? Like, that's really like an interesting question, isn't it? That just shows how like lacking in any like nurturing or care they were ever supposed to be set up to do. And then thinking about your research in relation to that is just like, it made some stuff that I did intuitively make sense. And, you know, because you talk about how these community spaces are not spaces of transaction. They are spaces with care, like, written into them. That's why they exist. And they do things that institutions say they want to do, but don't end up doing, right? And you pointed out this morning, you were like, you don't see community centers making big statements about Black Lives Matter because it's written into the activity that they do. They are actually demonstrating that through the work that they do. Whereas it has to be articulated by a big institution because it's not clear actually that they care at all through their activity. And which is why this feels like such a hollow moment, right? And so during the research, like, and this was very instinctive, but it became like a trope within it, was just that I didn't end up talking to people really in places of consumption. I ended up speaking to people in community centers, in people's homes. A lot of the time I would cook people dinner and we would talk. And that changed the conversation. And there's this bit in your research, isn't there, about this idea of shrinking community space and where do people go? They end up sitting in McDonald's. And what does that do to the conversation that you're going to have? And what does that do to you if actually you can't really afford to buy food? Like, are you like on guard? Are you having a conversation about your feelings? Or are you having a conversation about something that you're consuming? And I realized as well, like through those conversations, that I felt really cared for in those spaces. And in a way that I didn't feel in other places. And that is to do with my background for sure, but it's also to do with the space. It's like, what is this space set up to do? Like, just go back to the logic of these spaces. And the logic of it, like these big institutions, is not care. It is consumption, and it is extractive, and it is about display. So it feels different, right? It's antithetical to care and communion. And so I guess like reading your work really made real sense of that in a way that I couldn't whilst I was like within it.
My second question was about describing a nourishing moment during your 15 years of work, like, and I think it leads up to what we've talked, which is, yeah, you know, you've done some incredible work in your time, and what was nourishing about that work, and what are the limitations, I guess, of kind of, and this is what you touch on in your research, which is like that you will, as an individual person with the intentions and lived experiences and background you have, be doing work to sort of, you know, almost agitate and trying to get people who are from marginalized backgrounds paid for their brilliant artistic work to be seen, to be sort of like for films to be seen by wider audiences that should be seen, to be given bigger stages, like doing that work of agitating. What aspect of that work has been nourishing for you, and why?
I don't know. I can't say that nourishing is like a good word to use about the work that I've done in the arts, and that's why interesting being like, you know, like my bio is like kind of funny at the moment, but it's like true. Like I haven't listed like anywhere that I've worked because I don't really feel proud of where I've worked. Like I don't feel like, yeah, of course, like sure, like I had an opportunity to like you know, invite people in, and you know, but what are the terms of engagement and who is most benefiting from it, right? And I don't think there's been a satisfactory answer to that. And so when I think about nourishment, I think about now, like, and I really do believe like, so, you know, there's loads of threads in this festival, which are just so powerful to me because we're talking about grief. We're talking about like new ways of being, new ways of thinking. This is all happening at a time when anything kind of feels possible, but at the same time where so much is being lost at the same time, right? Like there's lots of grief, but there's also lots of possibility. So if I think about nourishment, I think about like now, like the conversations that I'm having now, and conversations that I feel like actually genuinely mutual, like have mutuality in them. And I want to like, I think I need to unlearn this kind of sense of looking back. And one of the reasons why I released the research last week was just because like, I don't really, you know, I want to talk about the things that we're talking about, but I don't really want to talk to people who work in institutions about how they should change, because I just think that actually, you know what, like it's time to defund our attention. Like I've spent so much time paying attention to them and thinking about how I could change those things. And actually that's not been a nourishing thing. That's been a really depleting thing. So what happens when I defund my attention from them? Like actually I've been able to see so much more that is happening, all of which is like, so much of which is like in this festival, actually. Shout out Imi, who's like amazing and has brought together like such incredible like thinkers and workers, and also like spending time like unlearning like all of the value systems that we're taught in an institution. So, you know, like thinking about like community arts like is such a peripheral thing in an institution, but as you so beautifully articulate in like your paper, like community arts are about collectivity. They're not just about the individual, right? So they are inherently political. Like community arts like are seen as like you say in your paper, like knitting circles and, you know, like street parties with bunting or whatever, but actually they're also like grime and these deeply like political observations about space and community, whatever that means, right? And when that becomes like packaged, then the institution wants it, but it's not like nurtured and nourished unless it's like heavily mediated through other institutions like art school or, you know, things like that. So in a way, like this idea of defunding attention is like really powerful to me. So I feel like my nourishment is about to begin. And like when we were like listening to each other's bios just now, I was like, I'd like looking forward to like having a bio like yours that I feel proud of. Like I feel like I'm starting again in a way. And like Fazana Khan led a beautiful session on Friday where she quoted an Audre Lorde poem called "Who Said It Was Simple," and she quoted like 2 lines from it, which said, "Which me will survive all these liberations." And I think about that, like, which bits of my work will survive this process? Like, which bits will I remember? Because so much of my work before made me forget things about myself. They made me forget and feel ashamed of parts of myself. I had to do that in order to progress. And I want to reactivate those things. And then out of that, what will I remember? And I don't know, like, at the moment, it feels like, I guess I don't feel super proud of things that I did. But I'm also really aware of how much nourishment there is out there. So I'm like not in this space of like cynicism. I'm in this space of like radical hopefulness, but also like really sitting with the reality of like, who did my work benefit for this amount of time? And that's a real live question for me.
So much incredible selfless value in the research, and also your reflectivity in it following that, and there's a lot of taking in that. And secondly, also, I find that bio really cringy. I kind of regret I should have toned it down a little bit. But anyway, just regards to
thousands of bios like that, Zain. We can compare bios another time.
Yeah, but that's a whole separate session. But I wanted to just read, if that's okay, if you feel comfortable with me reading it, this because also for people listening, this will give you a sense of when you read Jemma's research in terms of traversing sort of analysis with a sense of lived experience and personal reflection. So this is Jemma writing about her experience of seeing a film called Rocks, which was meant to be released in spring 2020. Obviously, it's been delayed. Yeah, it's been delayed, hasn't it? So, but it's an incredible film. I was lucky enough to see it as well. And I'm just going to read the extract of Jemma talking about seeing this film. So they asked me to cover some screenings. One of them is Rocks. I'm so excited about the film, but I haven't seen it, and asked them to get me into the press screening in the morning. It is the usual crowd. I'm pretty sure I am one of the only non-white people there. The press screenings are tiny this year, and everyone seems to want to watch it. I get there late, and there is a single seat in the middle of the row. The lights have gone down, and no one stands up when I come in. I have a bag as I have to work later, so I barely fit through. They tut and huff, and I slide myself into the seat, hot and ashamed, feeling like though I am working. The film makes me think about me and my brother, about being home alone and caring for others when you are so young and not fully remembering when you were carefree. The fullness of lives despite and because of those cares. Young Londoners that aren't going to the BFI, Tate and British Museum, about learning to take up space in cultural environments, but about wandering around the ends, sitting in the living room watching TV because your parents are working and don't really do culture. It's a London full of alternative systems of care enacted by the young and the old, the familiar and unfamiliar. It's an experience I rarely get to reflect on. It's a reality I might have taught myself to forget. Later at the screening, there are what feels like 20 people on stage. Everyone on stage is excited, heightened with emotion. The girls are amazing. The film fills me with hope. We use up the Q&A and asking everyone what it feels like to show the film in London. I lean into my accent. I don't pretend to be different. I feel at ease and in dialogue. Even though the girls are so nervous, they barely I don't feel invisible like I normally do. The stage is bright and I can only see the first few rows of the cinema. All I can see are white people with college expansively on their sofa seats. From the stage, it seems so nonchalant to me, indifferent to the energy pulsing on stage. On stage, it feels like London. Off stage, it feels like the places we never went to when we were younger, and all the places I am so often in now. All the places where it feels like I'm taking the last seat, but no one has told me where it is. At the end, I get my bag to leave and see the security gather to guide people out the building as the big name producer arrives for the next screening. The Rocks audience comes out and a lot are penned into little sections in the foyer. Out there, I see lots of black women who have been in the screening. They are crying about their daughters, about their mums. I see Teresa, who wrote the film, screaming in recognition with tears streaming down her face. Her sister, who she wrote Rocks to honor a love letter for her, has unexpectedly arrived to surprise her. The foyer is so bright and sharp-edged, it can't contain this emotion with any dignity. I suddenly feel out of body, not sure what to do. I feel a hand on my arm and turn. It's my friend Toby, a black woman, a Londoner, as moved to emotion as all of the others. She hugs me so tight. I can't remember what we say. I'm so grateful that she found me and extended that embodied softness and care. I become more aware of how absent it was before. Thank you for that passage. It was really beautiful.
I think Toby's on the call. Shout out Toby. He's amazing.
Shout out Toby. That was, for me, just that for me crystallizes, it crystallizes the kinds of things you're saying in the research and what you're saying right now, which is that there's this really tangible disconnect between the work that was made in Rocks and who the protagonists are, and what it represents in terms of young black and brown Londoners, and the two main protagonists being black girls, and in contrast with how that work is being consumed in that environment. And it kind of crystallizes what you said in your analysis, which is that there's a cultural apartheid, right? Which is the quote from Madani. And it's interesting to me. It's like you've talked about before about who that work should be seen by, and I think it leads up to what we're talking about, which is like, yeah, who benefits from that, who sort of like, and you discuss this in your research, which is how institutions might use work because they see cultural diversity as a business case. They see it as a mechanism of business to something that accounts for racial inequality historically and accounts for oppression, and doesn't account for the thinking that actually what we should be doing is redistributing and what we should be doing is reparations, because there's no acceptance of that at all. So for me, that's why I found that passage so really beautiful, because from seeing the film myself as well, and everyone who's on the call should definitely see it if you haven't. It's incredible. It represents a part of London that many of us will be familiar with growing up, and many of us will be familiar with now. But it's shocking that it's not been. It's shocking that a film like that is, it's taken this long to be made. But there is also
no, I think that's really interesting because it's the loss, and I think that often, like I think like last week we had this email from the chief exec of the BFI, right? Like a Black Lives Matter like email, and in it said that they were drivers in inclusion, and I guess like the experience with Rocks highlighted what had been taken from me actually, and just like having like a friend, like having someone just like recognize what that moment might have felt like, for whatever reason, like that they were feeling emotional, whatever, I'm not saying that person was a psychic or whatever, but just to intuitively know that was a moment of emotion rather than a moment of transaction, and to really feel like, I'd spent that day, I'd watched the film in the morning, like the programming team hadn't shown it to me before, I'd just been asked to cover it. And in the programming team, I was one of the only people who had a connection to the film in that sense. And I hadn't seen it, and that felt weird to me. And then also just like that really like intense feeling of like, I haven't ever seen this before. Like, and I started to remember things that I hadn't really thought about for a really long time, or at least hadn't been able to articulate, right? And you don't get to do that like in these spaces, there are so few people from those kinds of social classes, or those even in London, when you're working in a cultural venue in London, like still, I mean, it's getting better, I guess, a little bit, but it's still so rare to actually meet someone from London working with you. And sometimes I wonder what London I grew up in, right? Because the London that you end up like frequenting when you're working in these places is totally different to the one that you lived in before. And I've noticed that during lockdown as well, because I live in like a really gentrified part of Hackney, and it was really interesting when at the beginning of lockdown, when I started organizing with like local like mutual aiders, it just became really clear that there were roads that were unrepresented with all the middle class people that were like part of the mutual aid group. And it made me realize, actually, I moved around my neighborhood, my new neighborhood, in a completely different way to the way that I would have moved around my old neighborhood, because I changed social class, right? And I think that's also what happens when you enter like the arts, is like there are certain things that you don't have access to. There are certain roads that don't exist, so you never get to go down them. And often those roads or those pieces of art that represent parts of you are the parts that make you whole. They're the parts that make you imagine something better, or they're foundational parts of you, right? And so I think like that passage is really interesting, because I find it really embarrassing, because it feels like a child wrote it. But also I think a child did write it, right? Like I think that was me as a child writing that, just like remembering something, and that memory that just isn't accounted for in my work. And so, yeah, like I think those moments just show to you, actually, it isn't a neutral thing that we don't have the artists or the work for the last 30 years. This isn't neutral. Something has been taken from us through 30 years of policy, through 30 years of decision making. Like, what would culture look like if those decision making hadn't been there? Like, what work could exist? Like, what would rocks have looked like if there were many rocks before, right? Like, and who would you be and who would I be? Like, how would we feel about ourselves? And there are so many things that are unaccounted for when we just pretend that we're just trying really hard, right? So it's not about it's not necessarily about describing the problem again and again, but it's really about, what might have been taken and what would have happened if it hadn't been taken, right? To sort of stick with the dream element rather than the problem element. And I think rocks really gave me a portal into that day. And it's still a really important foundational part of the text, I think.
But I think you're right. Like, exactly what I feel also the research did. It's about, in order to understand what's next, in order to imagine and to be able to dream, this is where I think there's that distinct bridge between the work, which links to something we've discussed earlier. We've discussed a lot earlier, but there's Hassan Valda, who's a curator. Shout out Hassan. He put together this like list of demands. It's like quite, it's somewhat like almost like a parody of those institutions, but it's like a list of what cultural institutions could do in response to Black Lives Matter. And a lot of what he outlines are like tangible things, which is exactly what you said. It accounts for what you've described in your research, which is what has been taken and what needs to be redistributed back. What are the forms of redistribution, which are the very beginnings? And he outlines like elements of funds that need to, how funds are allocated, how institutions need to redistribute to specific specific areas of work, how trustees function, all sorts of different elements he breaks down. But yeah, completely agree with that. I think cases don't obviously inevitably render these community spaces as invisible. They don't see them as valuable, and it's partly why, like, for example, you have this new sort of trend of, I think councils, local authorities have got really clever when it comes to community art space and what they consider as valuable in that. And like also shout out Delia Snoosy, who does a lot of work in this area, and his research is cited in both mine and your research. So it's like there's a lot of research that's coming out these days. It's like a
but that's also like, you know, so Delia's research, which you sent to me, which became so important for me, right? Like for making connections to like making connections that you're not allowed to make in an institution because they're just like too wild. So what like Delia's research is called We Are Ghosts, and it's about institutional indifference towards working class communities in London, right? And how that affects their sense of, and it leaves so much space for their own testimonies, their own self-definitions. It tells a proper lived embodied experience and a really nuanced experience as a result. Anyway, it helped me to understand the ways that the state operates as being a really similar way to the way that the arts operates, right? And this might sound really obvious to like everybody, but when you're working in an institution, that's not always so obvious because there's always this sense that, yeah, that you're in the liberal arts elite, right? You're progressive, you're this. How could you like replicate the behaviors of like the conservatives? Like, how could that happen? But obviously we're seeing that more and more. It's being articulated so much. And this thing about like you both doing research and me doing research, and I'm really interested in that. Like, why are we having to do that actually? Why is it us that are having to do that? And what are we searching for? And I think with like Hassan's piece is like an answer to that, is like we are paying attention to something that nobody has been paying attention to, and we are making connections that actually nobody wants us to make, because actually it isn't at the service of people that have been benefiting most from us not making those connections. And in Hassan's piece, he turns the attention, so he defunds the attention from us and our problems to the problems of the people that have been being in charge. And he's essentially saying, you know, you've been marking your own homework for a really long time, and now someone else is going to do it, and look what we all find. And he's bearing witness to things that are not borne witness to, and that's what you're doing in your research, right? Like when I read your research, you're bringing to life these spaces that probably most decision makers, most directors of institutions, they're spaces that aren't necessarily familiar to them. They're probably not spaces that they walk past very often. They're certainly not spaces that they walk into. So how can they care for them as a result? If they don't even know what they are and what their function really is, then how can you care for that thing, right? And it's kind of, and I think that the research is this form of bearing witness to something that you inherently know is important. And I think it's not just, collecting data. I think there's something inherently like political about it if you are drawing attention to something that hasn't been drawn attention to. And one of the major like practitioners that I thought about a lot was Adrienne Marie Brown in the course of the research. And one thing she says is what you pay attention to grows, right? So this is another way of thinking about defunding attention, is like if you stop paying attention to one thing and start paying attention to another, then that will grow. And I feel like that's what Hassan is advocating for in his statement. And they're all really actionable, like the recommendations, like they're really simple. So that begs the question, why aren't they happening? Because, you know, in a piece that the White Pube wrote, Hassan is like quoted as talking about like community arts with like a gallery called the Chisenhale in Tower Hamlets, and talking about some community work that they did. And he just sort of says, why don't you just swap budgets? If it's such a mutual situation, like what if you just swap budgets for a year? And, you know, it's just these simple questions, which they really need to be answered, right? Like, answer it. Like, if it's not possible, then just articulate why. Because I've been articulating for a really long time. You've been articulating for a really long time. We're spending all our times articulating the value of something. So let's articulate why you're not doing things, actually, rather than constantly articulating what you will do and supposedly what you have been doing. I feel like there's something in all of those pieces that's really important.
Also not having to, switching the onus on the people that have the power, or like, you know, it being in demand. There's an interesting thing about the nature of asset stripping and how that happens in terms of community spaces or assets in London specifically, which I'm speaking to what I have experience in, or sort of like I've looked into, and in the North Kensington context, seeing how, for example, activists were trying to save the North Kensington library, which existed for 100+ years, and how local councillor, a lot of their campaigns around saving that library building, right, which was going to be replaced with a private school by a local council there, was about bearing witness and actually naming specific councillors, right? And it was like you said, it was literally calling them out and saying, and that for me, I think that has like a lot. I've learned so much from campaigns like that, led by people or co-led by people like Ed Daffin, who co-authored the Grenfell Action blog. Shout out Ed. And a lot of what a lot of his form of thinking about activism is also bearing witness and switching the onus in a similar way that Hassan's done, which is the councillor Rockfielding Mellon. Why have you got your child on the waiting list for a private school, which you want to move into a local library that's existed for 100+ years? Now they've completely U-turned post Grenfell on all those community assets, including a local college. But yeah, it's interesting to me that all of these things are easily, as you said, they're all possible. We can see that these decisions aren't like, and when they try and tell, like there's one really good quote I've heard from, I won't say which like leader of an art institution told me, but they were saying change is like a boat, like a ship, and it's going to take a lot to move it. Like basically what they were trying to intimate was that, it's not an overnight process, things will take time. It's a long U-turn, huge, massive boat. It takes time to switch directions, blah, blah, blah. But it's exactly what you described, which is, agents of stasis. I'm so bad at saying that word. Sorry.
Well, me too. Stasis. Yeah, I don't know. There were loads of words in that paper, which when I say out loud, I'm not sure if I understand if they're a word or not. But this boat thing is like, I think they must learn this boat thing somewhere. Like, where do they learn it? Because everyone uses this boat analogy, and it's very problematic because there are lots of layers to this boat analogy, right? Like, there are different decks to this boat, and like there are people jumping off this boat actually, and how do you account for them? And who is this boat for? Like, and who told you you're equipped to drive it if you can't turn it around? Like, this is crazy to me, right? Like, I find this incremental change argument is completely defunct now. Like, I think, like, and this is the exciting moment of this. Like Mia Mingis, who is this incredible thinker who introduced me to this concept of pod mapping, but also tweeted this thing. I'll talk about pod mapping in a minute, but tweeted this thing the other day about this moment and about how so many things that were before thought to be impossible changed overnight due to this global pandemic. So we can never listen now when people say that change is hard because it happened overnight. All this stuff that we thought could never happen, like who thought that all, like this isn't a new thing. I'm sure everyone on this call has had this thought. So I don't want to like labor it, but I think it's so important that we like can't let these images like continue. And when we think about dreaming, actually, like what new kind of images are we going to talk about when we talk about like change, or when we talk about leading change, or you know, all of that. Like, what new images are we gonna use? And this idea of pod mapping is really powerful to me, because it's like the opposite of how mutual aiders have been working, and also how institutions work, right? So basically the idea of pod mapping is that you move from one location to the other through deep connections of trust, right? So you think about, if you want to get over to, I don't know, a certain community in the area, you need to think about all the different people that could actually meaningfully connect you to that person. And you have to only engage with people with whom you have a mutuality in the first place, right? So that means, would you go to them in times of like trauma and distress? Like, would you care for them, basically? Could they care for you? And imagine what would happen if that is how we did all of our work, right? We'd probably be slower, but we'd be more intentional. We'd be more meaningful. We'd probably be transformed quite regularly, right? Because of the way that we were engaging with people, because you can't just extract from people that you care about. You learn from people that you care about. So yeah, I think, these images that are just thrown about by people to make excuses for why things have stayed the same, like, need to be deeply challenged, I think.
100%. When you told me that pod example, it really, it is the exact opposite of the very top-down extractive approach that local authorities and bodies will undertake. And it kind of, I guess in both of from my perspective in the research around community arts organizations, a lot of that is grappling with, because I talk about mapping as well, based off an example called Mapping Oakland. And it's what's interesting about the pod mapping example and Mapping Oakland is they both challenge the fundamental assumptions, and they switch up the methodology, which like is inspired a lot of what Marie Brown says, which is like, if it doesn't, like, you know, if something, I'm paraphrasing in the least poetic way, like, if something doesn't work and try something completely different. Wow, that's the worst paraphrasing. Basically,
no, but it's about not pushing too hard. It's about moving gently and intentionally, right?
And that's, I think that example of Mapping Oakland was exactly that. It was like how it's very different from pod mapping, but it was the methodology in which was like gathering testimony from POC run community arts organizations in Oakland, and saying, what are the challenges you're facing? How have institutions rendered you invisible? What would you need to sustain you? And I think part of that is like building coalitions of care and solidarity in order for those organizations to grow and sustain themselves, and thrive ultimately. But it's also about recognizing, it's partly also recognizing where the power lies, which I think is partly what I was thinking about when I was writing my research, which was, my intention was how organizations here, community arts organizations that tend to be run by people of color, tend to be run by people of color who are volunteering and are underpaid, and are serving their community not only in participatory arts context, but also in welfare, and doing a lot of frontline work. And how can this research be intentional and assist them in the work that they do? And then I think it ended up switching halfway, where I was like, you know, which is why it echoes what the recommendations were, which were like, who has the power in this context? But I think we've had a conversation since then, which has made me reflect, which is thinking about not making this appeal to, you know, this sort of like attempt to say, please, like, can you help us? It's more about switching that up into more of a bottom-up approach. And I think that's what this movement currently, this like political consciousness that's happening, that movement is like stimulating.
Yeah, it's like, where is meaning generated, right? Is meaning generated by validation from the top, or is it meaning generated by, what you do? But that's complicated, because if you're starved from the top, then what work can you do to nourish from below? And so I guess it's kind of this idea of autonomy is like really important. And I think that's the thing that we're both grappling with in our work, is like that even despite indifference from the top, like both community organizers and spaces, the people that run these spaces, are doing all this work despite, and then cultural workers embodied indifference in the arts are also, despite indifference from the top and despite absolute contempt in sometimes actually from the top, are still actualizing good work. But what would happen if what indifference from the top didn't exist? Like, what would it happen if you just didn't need to ask for permission? And so like a lot of your work is really inspiring in the sense of like, and so many people actually like represented in Department of Dreams, like Amara's work, like just like looks at space and land and thinks about like how to not ask for permission. How can we do that? Like, how can we just be autonomous and really let the value of our work speak? And that's what I would love to like dream of. And it's really hard sometimes when we think about like, where do you even get money from? And Imi and Fazana have set up, along with a lot of other people, like Resourcing Racial Justice, this fund, which is just so incredible. And when you look at like the application form for that, it doesn't do the things that make you feel tired when you look at an application form. And it allows you to ask for money to rest, because how amazing is that? And what could you do if you could rest, right? Like, it's incredible. But those funds are not, that's the only fund I've ever seen that lets you do that, right? And so, yeah, thinking about that as well. There's a question in the chat box, actually.
Yeah. Do you want me to read?
Yeah. So basically, it's around cultural institutions being super London-centric. Do you think that addressing the London versus absolutely everywhere else in the UK cultural apartheid, with many layers of race and class within that, should also be key to any defunding of attention and/or resource? So we've talked a little bit about this today, haven't we? In terms of, so there's two things. Like, one is like, I could only speak for London meaningfully in the way that I wanted to speak, because I wanted to develop like really like deep relationships and of trust. And I think with the idea of defunding of attention outside of there, it feels like pod mapping is like a really good tool for me to make meaningful ideas of what we should defund our attention from, because whatever is dominant in one community will not be the same in another. And I think we had a really interesting conversation, which is a side one, which I'll let you lead on, Zain. But in terms of this London centricity, I think we just have to move out from our location to make the conversation relevant. I'm not sure if I'm getting to the real question that you're asking, Alexander. I'm really sorry if I'm not. But I feel like sometimes there is a misunderstanding of what London is. When we look at cultural institutions, like there's this sense that it's a really like privileged place. I know that's not what you're saying, but and that these cultural institutions are so gentrified that they don't actually move out from their local, because like London's massive as well, right? So we just thinking about locality is like the key to any meaningful conversation about location, whether it's London or it's Manchester or if it's like a rural location. Being like inclusive and pluralistic is only meaningful if you think about where you are located in the first place, which is so different from how funders ask you to demonstrate it, which is always visibly.
I think you're like, just to add to that, like you'll see how, for example, bodies that disseminate funding will ask in really tokenistic ways to think about regionalism. right? And you're exactly right. I think part of my limitation in my research, which I wish I did and applied the way you did to yours, which was acknowledging location. And what Jemma did in her research was acknowledge that there are limitations to, that her experience speaks to her experience of London, and that's where her context lies. And I think that also speaks to like what everyone's individual context is. If you're a working class background Londoner, so in a different part of London, it doesn't really necessarily make sense for you to sort of say, you know what, this is London centric. Like I'm just going to think about Brum, because you have no connections tangibly to that. You have no connections to that tangible place. Like you can't, unless you have family there, you're not really going to be able to understand the context in Brum or Bradford or Manchester. So in your what I mean to say is in your localized context, I think there's a question around defunding of attention. And just to build on the point that Jemma made about how London is perceived, I think there's a very insidious like political argument around London, which everyone will be familiar with, which is the metropolitan London elite, or whatever these phrases are, and like, Islington being like a privileged place. That's just complete, like, it's just such rubbish when you hear it. And I think obviously that's not part of the question, but I think that feeds into the perception, and I think it feeds into how, how funding can end up becoming a tick box thing, as opposed to something that's deep and meaningful. But not to say that there shouldn't be connections drawn between what's happening in different contexts, and those connections shouldn't be drawn. I think I agree with Jemma, and I think they should be done in meaningful ways. And I don't think that, what I mean to say is also, it's not the work of marginalized people within context in London to make those connections. Like that's just not that's just, it's not your context, it's not your location. I think it's and those collaborations and those instances of meaningful exchange can happen in organic ways as well. And it's most directly in sort of Imi inviting Jemma to do this dialogue, and then Jemma inviting me, and then I visited Impact Hub for a talk separately as well, and those kinds of organic exchanges can happen and do happen.
I think I'm sort of like, as we're talking, I'm sort of settling with Alexander's question a bit more, and I think there's something really I think what we've probably missed in that is exactly what is in this question, which is like all that anyone ever talks about is like London is this and London is like this, like, diverse kind of very over-resourced space, and then there's the rest of the country, of the UK, sorry. And it's not helpful, but it's also a product of the way that funding is spoken about and the way that difference is spoken about. So when we talk about the stuff that I looked at in my research, I was so shocked by how whenever like these executive summaries of like these reports were made, like people would switch, like whoever wrote them would switch from looking at the proportional representation of the UK. So looking at, BAME directors across the UK, like based on the proportion of BAME people across the UK, and just forget like how crazy the disproportionate nature of that becomes when we're in London, right? And so I think so much of this confusion and this unhelpful way of thinking about our connections to each other, our connections to place, the public sector's like responsibility to represent the work of the UK comes from actually just this really obscuring language that is about absolving themselves of accountability for something, and so it really is like based in an untruth. So it's like gaslighting, right? And so you spend so much time on that, like make it make sense, right? Like, so spend your whole time like thinking that you don't get to spend time like thinking, how could I make it better? You're always making it make sense, and you're not making it make better and more meaningful. So I find these kind of really simple tools that are rooted in like disability justice and transformative justice, rooted in like really interpersonal communities, much more helpful to undo that learning, that logic that we're trained into through like these funding models and these institutions.
I hope that answers your question, Alex. Thank you for asking it.
Yeah, there's loads in there. Hey, Nikki.
Hey, Jemma. Hey, Zain. Wow, my mind is blown. I have to admit, I wasn't familiar with your research prior to today's session, and there's so much in there to unpack and repack and share and take away from. And I really like what you had to say towards the end, then, where you're saying we need to build coalitions of care and solidarity. You know, we're here all for that. And you, Jemma, there's so many kind of soundbites away, but you know what you said about defunding our attention, and I think unlearning what we've learned in key institutions is really powerful, and it's so basic, but it's only when you say it out loud you think, yeah, all the stuff that we've learned is what's shaping the systems and the institutions and our learning and what have you. So thank you both so much for sharing your research and your thoughts and conversation. We're just coming to the end of this session, so for those people who are still on the call, so thank you everyone who's taking part in today's session, for your comments, particularly Zain and Jemma for your contribution, which has been wonderful. And yes, thank you. Take care.
Thank you so much, Nikki. Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you.
See you all soon. Take care.
Bye.
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 Bye.